Good evening. I'm Dr. Michael Smith, a member of the Montgomery County chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and a member of Suburban Hospital's Board of Trustees and Community Health Improvement Advisory Council. Thank you for joining us this evening for the 18th Annual Men's Health Symposium, Brain-Gut Connection, in celebration of National Men's Health Month. As part of the hospital's commitment to care for the health and well-being of its community members, we hope that this evening will be educational and informative. I would first like to thank the Frederick H. Boas Community Fund for their generous contribution to supporting men's health initiatives, including tonight's program. Without our valued community contributors, special events such as this annual symposium would not be possible. This evening, we have a treat. We will hear from two distinguished physicians from Johns Hopkins Medicine to help us understand how uniquely connected one's gut health is to the brain. Through their years of focus in their respective areas of neuro, gastroenterology, and psychiatry, Drs. Jay Pasricha and Glenn Jordan Treisman will educate us on current research of the enteric nervous system, or the second brain, and how digestive signals can be attributed to mood changes associated with depression, stress, and anxiety. As part of the hospital's commitment to care for the health and well-being of its community members, we hope that this evening will be both educational and informative. Before we start, I just want to review a few housekeeping items. Tonight, we are on the Zoom webinar format. This means that all participants will remain on mute throughout the evening, but you will be able to submit questions throughout the session at any time by typing in the Q&A box. You can find it at the bottom of your screen. We are recording tonight's presentation, and it will be made available in the coming days. Last but not least, your feedback is very important to us and helps us build strong programming for future events. A link to our anonymous evaluation will pop up at the end of the program. We kindly ask that you take a moment to complete it, as it helps the staff at Suburban Hospital in planning future programs for our community. Thank you again for joining us, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pasricha and Dr. Treisman. Dr. Pasricha received his MD degree from All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi in 1982. Subsequently, he trained in internal medicine and pulmonology at Georgetown University, DC General Hospital, and Tufts New England Medical Center, respectively. Thereafter, he trained in gastroenterology at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and then stayed on faculty at Johns Hopkins University as Director of Therapeutic Endoscopy at Johns Hopkins Hospital and Associate Director of the Marvin Schuster Center for Gastrointestinal Motility. Dr. Pasricha is currently the Vice Chair of Medicine for Innovation and Commercialization at Johns Hopkins. He is also the Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Neurogastroenterology, as well as the newly created Food, Body, and Mind Center. In addition, he holds appointments as professor in the Department of Neurosciences in the School of Medicine and at the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business. At a national level, Dr. Pasricha is the chair of the NIH-funded Multi-Center Gastroparesis Consortium. In the past, he served on the National Commission on Digestive Diseases appointed by the Congress to provide a roadmap for progress in gastrointestinal disorders. He is also the founding chair of the Center for Gastrointestinal Innovation and Technology. Dr. Pasricha served on the FDA GI Drug Advisory Committee for several years and continues to provide advice to the agency on an ad hoc basis. He is also a consultant for numerous biomedical device and drug companies in gastroenterology and endoscopy. Dr. Pasricha has authored nearly 300 manuscripts and book chapters, including contributions to Cecil Textbook of Medicine, Yamada Textbook of Gastroenterology, and Goodman and Gilman's Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics. He has been the Associate Editor for Gastroenterology, the Senior Editorial Advisor for Digestive Diseases and Sciences, and has served as Associate Editor for the Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and nutrition and associate editor for gastrointestinal endoscopy. Next, we will also hear from Dr. Glenn Jordan Treisman. He is the Eugene Mayer III Professor of Psychiatry and Medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He is director of the AIDS Psychiatry Service and the Johns Hopkins Pain Treatment Program. The Pain Treatment Program provides care for chronic pain syndromes and is a national referral source for patients with intractable pain. He is the co-founder and co-director of the Amos Center, a program that studies atypical GI disorders and the relationship between food, the nervous system of the GI tract, the microbiome, and disease. Dr. Treisman is internationally known for his engaging presentations, his efforts to promote the integration of psychiatry and medicine, and his vigorous commitment to the betterment of patient care for underserved populations. He is best known for his groundbreaking work in the field of HIV, where he has been described as the father of AIDS psychiatry. He is the author of The Psychiatry of AIDS, the first comprehensive textbook on the subject, as well as numerous articles on the issues of mental health in the HIV clinic. As part of a lifelong commitment to education, Dr. Treisman directed the residency program in psychiatry for 9 years and has delivered lectures at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in courses on neuroscience, psychiatry, pharmacology, clinical skills, and the Physician in Society course, as well as lectures in the School of Public Health, the School of Nursing, and in numerous other departments. The American College of Physicians recognized his work with the presentation of the William C. Menninger Memorial Award for distinguished contribution to the science of mental health. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Treisman and Dr. Pasricha. Doctors, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I'm going to just start by saying thank you to the organizers for giving us a chance to speak to all of you, and thank you for taking the time late Thursday evening to come and listen to us. As Dr. Smith said, we hope this is educational and informative, and perhaps you'll hear some things that you may never have heard before. So with that, I'm going to share my screen for a few minutes. This is really not going to be a slide lecture. Dr. Treisman and I are here to interact with you as intimately as possible in terms of question and answers. So please feel free to populate the screen with your questions, and we'll take the time to answer them. So I don't know if you can share my screen.
You can. The thing's on the bottom of my screen, green button.
Okay, can you see it?
Yep.
All right, so as Dr. Smith said, Glenn and I are co-directors of the Johns Hopkins Amos Center, which was funded by a generous gift from the Amos family, to study the interaction between food, body, and the mind. And a key player in this interaction is what we call the enteric nervous system. This is the nervous system, the second brain, as Dr. Smith said, that you've never heard of perhaps. But the funny thing about it, it's contained entirely within the wall of your gut, from your esophagus, your food pipe, down to your rectum. And this is what it looks like in a cartoon. If you slice up the gut in a cross section, you'll see there are layers of muscle, and interspaced between them are the bundles of neurons. These neurons are responsible for two major things, but as we'll show you, can also participate in a lot of other vital functions. So the one thing that everybody knows about is gut motility. What makes you poop in the morning, for instance, is all a function of the enteric nervous system. How you swallow is a function of the enteric nervous system. How your stomach stores food and digests it is also a function of that. And in order to digest food, the gut has to produce large amounts of fluids and enzymes, and this is also controlled by the nerves. So what I'm going to show you a video of is the mouse enteric nervous system. And in red is the network of neurons. You can see how extensive this network is. It almost looks like somebody scooped out a part of the brain in your head, but it's actually all within your gut. This is a 3D rotation view showing you these neurons. So this is the second largest nervous system in the body. It has 400 to 600 million neurons in the human body. That's more than the entire spinal cord. And as I said, it's contained entirely in the wall of the gut. Did you know that 90% of the body's serotonin is in the gut, and 50% of the body's dopamine is also in the gut? So I liken this to Mini-Me from that movie from many years ago, Mike Myers movie. And it really is a miniature brain, and that is as sophisticated and as complicated as the other one is. Now, the thing about this brain and the other brain is they communicate with each other every nanosecond. And this goes back a long, long time in the evolutionary history. So on the left here, I'm showing you a cross-section of a tarantula spider, and you can see that this is the stomach of the spider, and it is wrapped very close to the brain of the spider. And this is because the gut is so important. It is our source of energy, and the brain is an energy trap. The brain has to have complete control of the gut, and it does that through what we call the vagus nerve, amongst other nerves. But the vagus nerve is really the super highway between the gut nerves and the brains inside your head. So yes, we're not spiders anymore, but as our brain moves northwards and our gut moves south, we maintain that communication through this long nerve. And this on the right side is showing you what the projections of this vagus nerve are in a rat stomach. So you can see this is coming from your brain, and it is wrapped completely around the stomach and burrowed into the stomach so as to monitor every function of the gut. So this is what we call the gut-brain axis, and it works both ways, and we'll talk about that. So that's how we listen to the gut, the vagus nerve. But what we're going to talk today about, and like I said, I would encourage you to ask questions and interrupt us as much as possible on this forum, is how this nervous system in the gut wall really helps the body and the brain and other organs deal with signals coming from the inside of the gut, particularly food, as well as, of course, the microbes, the trillions of microbes that live in our colon, and how these signals are conveyed to the brain and to other organs, and together are responsible for all the functions that are necessary for a healthy life: cognition, act of thinking, emotions, whether you feel happy or depressed, whether you feel anxious or at peace, your metabolic status, whether you're controlling your glucose well or not, all of this, and your immune system, whether you are susceptible to immune disorders, is also a function in part of how well your gut is doing. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn it over to Glenn to kick off some of his thoughts on this subject.
Well, thank you. And I want to also thank the organizers for inviting us. We very much appreciate being part of this. My career starts with HIV, the HIV virus, which damages the nervous system of the stomach. And a lot of patients that I saw in the HIV clinic had GI problems. And as I got more and more interested and worked more with chronic pain patients, we started to realize that a lot of chronic pain happens in the GI tract. And Dr. Pasricha and I have been working kind of towards each other from the gut toward the brain and from the brain toward the gut for the last 25 or 30 years. And we finally started to talk about GI pain and realized we did a lot of things in a very similar way and had a lot of very similar understanding about how these things work together. So as he said, you have an entire nervous system in your gut, and that nervous system communicates with your brain. So the conditions that we see commonly in GI often have brain consequences, and the conditions we see commonly in the psychiatry clinic and the neurology clinic have gut consequences. So things like Parkinson's disease, we're just learning your Parkinson's disease is caused by the transmission of a protein from your gut to your brain, or a substance from your gut to your brain. And many of the people who have Parkinson's disease, the first sign of it is constipation, but the second sign of it might be depression. So there's a tight relationship between these different disorders that we see in the clinic and what's going on in your gut and your brain and how they communicate. We talked about the microbiome some. So you're about 40% human cells and about 60% bacterial cells, although bacterial cells are a lot smaller, so they don't take up, oh, it says my volume is too low. Let me see if I can remedy that. Sorry. I'll try to fix the volume. Is that better? Can you hear me better now? Okay, so the microbiome, the bugs that live in your gut, help digest your food and help set your immune system and communicate with your gut and your brain, and play an active role in your everyday life. And we have the idea that our microbiome belongs to us. Our microbiomes believe that we belong to them, and they think they've bred humans to carry them around. So there's a very complex number of microbes in your gut, mostly bacteria, but there are fungi in there and other things. And the bacteria in your gut, there's about 10,000 different species of bacteria, all competing for the food that you eat, helping you digest it, and sending signals to your gut and your brain in complicated ways. So the enteric nervous system is sort of the go-between between the microbiome and your brain. So signals come from the bacteria in your gut. They go through your enteric nervous system up the vagus nerve to your brain, and signals from your brain go down your gut and affect the microbiome. So there's a tight relationship between those things. And one of the things that we're learning about is the way changes in your gut microbes can affect your brain functioning and vice versa. If you starve a person, they can live easily 3 days without food. As long as you have enough water, you live easily 3 days without any food. And humans really only have to eat every couple days, because all of your cells are bathed in blood, and your blood brings nutrients to all your cells. However, your gut bacteria don't have a blood supply, and they have to survive on what's in the gut. So they tell you they want you to eat a lot more often than you have to. You have to eat every couple days, but you eat every 6 to 8 hours, which is about the time the food gets past your microbiome. So your gut signals you that you're hungry, and you eat. So the microbiome plays a huge role in illness and behavior. Very fascinating role. So some common problems that we see are constipation, diarrhea, a condition we call irritable bowel syndrome, where we have alternating constipation and diarrhea, and a variety of inflammatory conditions of the gut. Those are very common disorders of the GI tract. Then at the top of your GI tract, there are commonly problems with your stomach, what's called dyspepsia, where your stomach doesn't seem to want to digest food the way you want it and gives you all kinds of difficulties. And then common problems with the endocrine glands that follow your gut down, your pancreas, your liver, your gallbladder, etc. So those things can get sick in different ways, but they also affect your brain in different ways. So one of the things that is very interesting is there are very high rates of major depression among people with bowel syndromes. And what patients will tell us is when their depression gets worse, their GI tract gets worse. And when their GI tract gets worse, their depression gets worse. So a lot of the anxiety and depression people feel may be coming from your gut. Same is true with your brain. If your brain is upset, if you are stressed, your gut will shut down and you'll have all kinds of trouble with your gut. So the two-way communication produces abdominal pain, produces dysmotility, which is the thing Dr. Pasricha started out studying, and produces difficulties with brain function and with getting adequate nutrition. So your gut absorbs nutrients that go through your bloodstream to your brain and also signals your brain through a series of chain of neurons called the vagus nerve.
Glenn, we have a question. I think this is a good point to answer that. Doug Wilson has asked, how do you alleviate GI anxiety? And this presupposes that there is something specific called GI anxiety and GI depression. Maybe you want to talk about it, and I can talk a little bit about what our research has shown.
Sure. So lots of people, when you ask them if they're depressed, they'll say yes, and they'll point right to their chest or right to their gut, because it seems like a lot of the signals for depression come from your gut. When people are depressed, they have low energy, they lose their ability to enjoy things, they get anhedonic, but there's also changes in their bowel habits. They often get trouble with their bowel habits. They often have GI pain associated with their depression, and they stop eating and lose weight, or eat too much and gain weight. So there's a disruption of the appetite centers and signals coming to your brain. And I know you have lots of basic science about that, but anxiety disorders occur in a number of different flavors, but the most common one that we see in patients shares a lot of its features with depression. So you can be depressed or anxious and have the same basic loss of dopamine function. So Jay, what have we learned about depression and anxiety and the microbiome in the gut?
So we've done some very interesting experiments, and one of them was published just a couple of months ago, where we irritated the stomach of neonatal rats with a very harmless irritant. Basically, the effect lasted a couple of days only. But they were in a vulnerable stage of their development. They were plastic, because at the neonatal stage, the nervous system is plastic. So then we did nothing. We just let them grow up normally. And when they became adults, we tested them for whether they had anxiety or depression. And there are ways you can, believe it or not, there are ways you can do that in rats and mice. And sure enough, they were anxious and depressed rats. And then we studied their brains, and there were profound changes in the centers in the brain that control mood, one of them being the amygdala. That's a specialized area of the brain that is really, really key to mood and anxiety. So how is that happening? Well, it turns out, at least in this model, that the irritation that we caused resulted in an influx of what we call mast cells. Mast cells are a particular kind of inflammatory cells in the stomach. And they were signaling to the vagus nerve. Remember that nerve I told you, which is the highway between the gut and the brain? They were causing the vagus nerve to start firing like crazy. And those firings, what we call noise, was causing those changes in the brain. So when we cut the vagus nerve, the anxiety and depression went away. When we suppressed the mast cells with a drug called ketotifen, the anxiety and depression went away. Now, the caveat here is these are rodent studies, and we don't know whether this applies to humans, but this is the first step. So the next step will be for us to say, okay, let's use ketotifen. It's not really approved here in this country except for ophthalmic eye use, but perhaps we can find a way to use that to test this hypothesis in humans.
So irritating your gut will cause depression. And another thing we've learned is that many people with depression have GI disorders. So it can go both ways. You can get depression from something and it can mess up your gut, and you can get problems with your gut and it can change your brain.
Yeah, that's very important, Glenn, because the vagus is a two-way highway, right? It goes, takes signals up and sends signals down. So I think everybody is familiar with butterflies in the stomach, right? That's a manifestation of that
Downward stimulation.
downwards reflex. Or there are some people who have a bowel movement when they're very nervous. That's another example of that. That's the top-down lane. But there is also a bottom-up lane that is equally important.
Right. And so, a lot of emotion seems to happen for people in the gut. They feel their emotions in their gut. When they're sad, it's in their chest or their gut. When they're happy and elated, they feel it in their body as much as in their brain. And that's partly an issue of the autonomic nervous system, the part of your nervous system that sort of runs the backgrounds of your body, being changed by your brain and vice versa. So
to answer your second question, Glenn, about what role the microbiome plays. So it's not clear that the microbiome itself, a normal microbiome itself, is maintaining your mood. But if the microbiome gets altered, your mood will get affected. We know that also from experimental studies, but there's also emerging evidence now in humans, which is one reason why there are so many attempts at using probiotics to help with these conditions. The trouble with the probiotics right now is they're relatively non-specific. They've not been formulated on a scientific basis. Somebody took an idea of one bacteria, put it in a pill, and started marketing it. I think we've now finally reached the stage in science that we can try to come up with much more effective probiotic formulations. And we've been working on one in the lab. This is from a company based in San Francisco, that in the same model of anxiety, gut-induced anxiety, this probiotic significantly attenuates it. So I think we're moving closer to the point where we can first say all anxiety and depression is not the same. It doesn't originate in the same roots, and it may not be treatable in the same way. So there may well be a gut-specific anxiety and depression, and there may be specific ways to treat that.
Yeah. The other thing is that your gut microbiome is affected by what you eat. So there are things that we eat that change the bacteria because it will feed specific bacteria in our gut. One of the latest studies that I think is very interesting is the discovery that in people who have bipolar disorder, eating foods with high nitrite concentrations like beef jerky can provoke mania. So what you're eating is changing your gut microbiome, and what's in your gut microbiome is changing your brain and maybe kindling these altered mood states. So we're hopeful and optimistic, actually, that some of these things will be meaningful. So there are probiotics, and then people are referring to some things as prebiotics. That is, things that will shape your gut microbiome by what you eat. I wanted to take a minute and talk about some of the problems that we face as a country, one of which is obesity, people being overweight. And people had the idea when I was a kid that this is all a matter of willpower, and you don't have any choice about, a total choice about whether you're fat or skinny. It's just a choice. It's turning out that people with different metabolisms are much more likely or much less likely to become overweight. And if you change people's microbiomes, their weight changes. So Dr. Pasricha could tell you about some of the experiments where we take the rats and sterilize their guts so they don't have any bacteria and feed them a special diet so they stay alive, because bacteria are necessary for people to stay alive on a normal diet, and rats. But if you sterilize their guts, so you don't have any bacteria, when you add the bacteria back, they gain a huge amount of weight eating the same amount of food, because your gut bacteria have a big regulatory effect on weight. And one of the signs of that is the issue of how much antibiotic exposure you get as you grow up. So the more antibiotics you get, the more likely you are to be overweight. And there are nice maps showing that in areas of the country where people use too much antibiotic, people tend to be more overweight than places where they don't. Another interesting fact is that—
Is that also, you think that also explains or could also be due to the widespread use of antibiotics for food
absolutely. And
for livestock?
Yeah. So the bacteria, the meat and chicken that you eat, one of the ways they get the animals to gain a huge amount of weight is by putting antibiotics in. They say it's to protect the animals from infection, but in fact, what they've learned is just like human beings, if you get animals chronic antibiotics, they gain weight. So people want to use antibiotics in food. The problem is that some of those antibiotics probably get into us and may play a role in the overweight epidemic that we face, the obesity epidemic that we face in the United States. If you're overweight, you're more likely to get diabetes. And an interesting thing is people who are overweight often have these gastric resections, bypass surgeries, gastric bypasses, to reduce their weight. One of the most fascinating things that happens is if you take rats that are overweight and do little gastric bypasses on them, the microbiome in those rats changes profoundly. And if you take the new microbiome from the previously fat rats that are now losing weight and implant them in fat rats without, sorry about that, my dog is barking, without the surgery, they will lose weight. So it seems like your gut bacteria play a big role in your weight set point. If you look at the types of bacteria that are in people's guts, there's a correlation between a number of different bacteria and weight. And if you have a different microbiome, it likely plays a role in how much weight you gain.
Well, for sure, some of the changes are due to microbiota, but that's a great segue for another thing that I wanted to highlight about the enteric nervous system, the gut brain. So Dr. Treisman just talked about gastric bypass surgery. As you know, that's a very popular method for treating morbid obesity. But one of the things we discovered with this very early on was that is almost a miracle cure for type 2 diabetes. So a lot of these patients have type 2 diabetes. And even before they lost a single pound of weight, before they walked out of the hospital, their diabetes was gone. And it's not clear how that's happening, but clearly the bypass is doing something. So if you think about it, what is the bypass in the bypass? What are they bypassing? They're actually bypassing the first part of the small intestine that comes off the stomach. We call this the duodenum. The duodenum is a very critical part of the intestine. This is where the first food signals are really being read by the nerves. And then all kinds of messages are being sent to the liver, to your muscle, to your fat tissue that, hey, big load of calories is coming. This is what it's composed of. Get ready. With bypass, that segment is gone. And the theory is because that segment is no longer sending signals, you actually cure diabetes. Now, why is this of practical importance, right? So if you think about it, surgery is not the only way to exclude nutrients from coming in contact with this first part of the intestine that we call the duodenum. So one of the companies that has started at Hopkins, it's called Glycine, came up with a very clever way to create a substance that you can swallow. And when you swallow it, it sticks to the lining of the duodenum and effectively forms a barrier that prevents the food from coming in contact with the gut lining. In effect, it is a bypass. And at least in rats, it is shown to be as effective in treating diabetes. And the good news is that they're going to start human studies later this year, and we'll find out if you can actually take the gastric bypass, the essence of the gastric bypass, and put it in a pill.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'm more excited, I have to say, Jay, about the possibility of changing your microbiome to accomplish that.
No, I'm not downplaying that, but I just think
No,
I think changing the microbiome is very difficult with the current technologies, but as our knowledge increases, as our tools increase, I think we'll get there. But it's hard. So one of the hardest things to do, and most of you in the audience can relate to this. One of the hardest things to do is change your lifestyle, right? And what we eat as adults is a lifelong consequence of culture, family, whatever we want to call it, that is so deeply ingrained in us. So this is one of the reasons why diets by themselves almost always fail to have long-term therapeutic benefit. Obviously the Mediterranean diet is great, but that's because the Mediterranean folks have grown up with that and it's in their culture. But if somebody started on a meat and potatoes diet, did it all his or her life, it's very hard for them to switch gears. So that's part of the human behavior that is one of the biggest barriers to health. And I think hopefully we can do things with the microbiome that will change not only the composition of the signals, but also change our behavior so we are actually more receptive to eating those kinds of diets. I think that's where you're going, Glenn, right?
Exactly. I'm glad you pointed it out because it's a huge issue. We want to change human behavior. And what humans want us to do is change their behavior for them. So people who come to me with problems with drugs and alcohol, they want to stop wanting drugs and alcohol rather than work at going to 12-step programs and working on sobriety. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to have a way to change people's appetites for things, what they want to do, to make it much easier for them to change their lifestyle. And I think we're going to be able to manipulate that ultimately by learning all these signals. I mean, there are several new drugs coming to do that.
Dr. Treisman, may I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
We have a couple of questions in the box, and since we're talking about food and its effects, we have a question from Mr. Doug Wilson. It says, could poor nutrition and certain stimulants contribute to aggressive or passive behavior?
We don't know the answer really. We know that heavy carbohydrate loads are associated with more agitation in some experimental settings, but we don't really know whether, and we know that poor nutrition can make people, if they're growing up, can make people cognitively impaired cognition in both humans and in animals. But what we don't know is how much of a role it contributes versus how much of a role the environment contributes.
Or genetics for that matter.
And genetics. But for a really cool experiment, if you take rats and you put some of them in a very impoverished environment where there's not a lot of toys to play with and not a lot of things for the rats to do, and then take another bunch of rats and put them in an environment where there's lots to do, the rats where there's lots to do will have much thicker cortex in their brains. They'll have more brain power than the rats grown up in an environment where there's little to do. And both of those rats won't have nearly as much cortex as a wild rat living in the wild, because wild rats are very stimulated by their environment or they get eaten by something. We have to, I think that the question of whether better nutrition is important, absolutely. It contributes, bad nutrition, it contributes to obesity, it contributes to poor lifestyle habits that last a lifetime, and it contributes to probably to the kind of muscle mass you develop in what you do. There is some evidence that some foods make people more aggressive. Like I said, nitrites can make people who have the right genetics more aggressive. But overall, we don't know the answer. But what we really want to do is improve nutrition, stimulation, and environment for people in a coherent and meaningful way. We want to give people the opportunity for them to kind of fully develop. And I think
it's not directly related to that question, Glenn, but I think it touches on it because I think this is probably one of the frequently asked questions of us. You want to talk about the role of gluten beyond celiac disease, the so-called gluten sensitivity?
well, sure. Go ahead. You brought it up and go.
I think it's so. There's a lot of, as you know, knowledge and perhaps misinformation about gluten. We know that in some patients we're genetically predisposed.
Tell them what gluten is, because not everybody knows what gluten is.
So gluten is a protein that's found in the wheat family of plants. And in some patients with celiac disease, they develop an immune response to that protein, and that causes all kinds of,
A true allergy.
an allergy or an immune response, which then causes all kinds of problems, particularly inflammation of the gut, that then results in a leaky gut. And then there are manifestations outside of the gut, everywhere from the brain to the heart to your peripheral nervous system, etc. But there's a much larger group of patients who don't do well with gluten, even though they don't actually have celiac disease. And these patients swear that if they go on gluten, they can get all these crazy manifestations, not just the gut reacting, but everything else. And one thing that really stands out when they speak to us is that gluten causes a brain fog. Their mental abilities are affected. They can't concentrate as much. Their memory becomes more fuzzy. And they've done the experiments on themselves, and we believe them because, they'll tell us, we tried it. This is what happened. I went on a gluten-free diet, felt like a new person, challenged myself again, exactly the same thing happened. Now, there are some studies that are emerging to say that this is real. But what the basis of this is, we don't know, because there's no true allergy, like Dr. Treisman said, there's no true autoimmune response. But perhaps it is either gluten, or some other wheat proteins that are interacting with either the microbiome or the nerves in the gut to produce these changes. So that's an example of a very specific food. Of course, it's in the carbohydrate family, a very specific food that in some patients, at least, I believe, truly affects them.
Affects their mental.
Dr. Pasricha, we have a follow-up question, I think, to your glycine comment earlier. It says, is there any positive correlation, i.e. Lexapro, and weight loss? That's from Mr. Stephen Soroka.
Oh, that's right up Dr. Treisman's alley.
Yeah.
Dr. Treisman is a world-famous neuropharmacologist. So
well, that's a big question. The question is, what drugs truly cause weight gain? What drugs cause an increase in appetite because they affect the appetite centers of your body? And what drugs are associated with people gaining weight because they get their appetite back? So if you look at the broad experience of patients with depression, some depressed patients gain weight, but more depressed patients lose weight. And when they get their appetite back, they will often regain weight and even overshoot where they were. So some of that is attributed to their depression getting better. How do we know that? Because some of those patients get ECT and they will still gain weight after their mood disorder.
You want to tell them what ECT is?
Yeah, so ECT is electroshock therapy and doesn't involve any drugs. there's also transcranial magnetic stimulation. So you can gain weight just from getting your appetite back after you're depressed. However, a lot of the drugs will cause people to increase their appetite because they interact with the appetite centers of your body. Remember, if I give you a drug for depression, I don't put it in your brain. It goes everywhere in your body. So a lot of the drugs that we use for depression, Dr. Pasricha and I also use to change gut function because they have targets in the gut. And unfortunately, sometimes the targets in the gut that we use in antidepressant cause an increase in appetite. Great if you're underweight, not so good if you're overweight. Lexapro is one of those drugs where if you look at the placebo-controlled trials, that is, we gave people Lexapro or sugar pills, and they didn't know which was which. There isn't much weight gain with Lexapro. There isn't much weight gain with SSRIs in general, except for paroxetine Paxil. Paxil is the only SSRI that's associated with real weight gain. However, some of the drugs we use that really help with gut dysmotility and other things, like mirtazapine, can cause a huge amount of weight. And then the experiment is, when you let rats eat whatever they want, do they gain weight on these drugs? And with a drug like mirtazapine, they gain weight, but it's because they eat more. You can weigh how much they eat each day, and there's a direct correlation between the weight gain and what they eat. On the other hand, there are other drugs like steroids, where even if you eat the same thing, you gain some weight. So, so the drugs don't generally cause you to gain weight. They generally cause you to eat 3 more bites per meal. And that occurs with lots of the drugs we use in depression and in psychiatry, but also lots of the drugs we use in other settings. So even antihistamines, if they get into your brain, can cause some weight gain.
So I want to pick up on the first part of what you said, Glenn, because I think it's really important. Dr. Glenn talked about anhedonia. Anhedonia means inability to find pleasure in the things that you used to find pleasure, right? When you used to go out to movies, it was fun, but when you're depressed, it's no longer fun. And why this is relevant is, think about it, what gives every animal, whether it's your puppy or it's humans, the most pleasure amongst those is eating. The joy of eating a good meal and the satisfaction that you feel after you've had a good meal. You know, we take it for granted because we live in an affluent country and we have access to all that. And if you're healthy, we really, really feel that pleasure. It's maybe subliminal in some ways, but it is a very, very important part of the pleasure that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And we eat 3 meals a day, typically, and we get pleasure from all of them. What happens with depression is that pleasure, that ability to feel pleasure, goes away. That's anhedonia. And so you eat less, or you don't enjoy eating. And if you don't enjoy eating, yes, you may say, I need these many calories, but there's no fun in it.
Although there are some people who actually eat more to try to get some pleasure.
That's right. So why don't you talk about your dopamine stuff here? Because I think it's really important.
So in your brain, that's the thing that makes you get out of bed every day is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. It's the neurotransmitter that you get when you hit a home run, or when your team scores, or when you get a raise, or all the other things that are good in life. And dopamine is released by eating. So if you're depressed and your dopamine receptors are turned off, when you eat, you don't get your usual, Most people will stop eating or eat less. Some people will eat more to try to get their dopamine, because the thing that gets us out of bed in the morning is dopamine. If you take experimental animals and you put a wire in the place where dopamine is in your brain, or a little tiny tube to put dopamine in that part of the brain, and you say to the animal, if you press this lever, you'll get dopamine, the animals will press that lever all day long. They'll just press it and press it and press it, trying to get more dopamine. And dopamine is the thing that makes us kind of do what we do. So dopamine has a huge regulatory role in eating and in sleeping, in sex, in work, in hobbies, and in exercise. The behaviors that are driven by sort of motivation. You look at, going back to the beginning of the question, if you look at people who are depressed, they've stopped doing a lot of the things they do for pleasure. And getting those things going again, getting more activated, takes time. So as they start to get better, they often get their appetite back before they've completely rehabilitated. So they can gain weight from that. So those are really important elements, because your gut can make you depressed. However, depression can make your gut worse and make your food not rewarding and make you eat weird things. And that can contribute to GI disorder dysfunction.
As a follow-up to that, we have a couple of questions. One from Mr. Richard B. It says, are there current known methods for maintaining a good biome, or is there yet consensus on exactly what constitutes a good biome? And to add to that question, Grace Wu, anonymous attendee says, well, how do you get a healthy gut biome? So those questions are kind of joined together.
Yeah, so that's a great question. You get much of your gut microbiome from passing through the birth canal. As you leave your mother's body, you get a big intake of bacteria that helps seed your gut, and they tell you something about what your microbiome is going to be. So kids born by cesarean section have less complex gut microbiomes, which are associated with some kinds of problems, whereas people who are born vaginally have a more complex microbiome, which is associated with less of those problems. In people, once they're growing up, what you want, and this goes to the question of, is a better nutritional environment better? Absolutely. If you eat a broad array of foods, you feed a broad array of bacteria. So when Dr. Pasricha and I have patients who have gut problems and have lost the ability to eat for long periods of time, we try to get them to eat a very broad, complicated diet and add new foods to their armamentarium, so they feed the different kinds of bacteria. A lot of your gut bacteria thrive on specific nutrients. And so a healthy diet is a broad, complex diet, unless you have food-specific problems like gluten that Dr. Pasricha mentioned. What you want to get a healthy microbiome, what you want is a healthy diet of a wide array of foods that can help feed the bacteria in your gut that are very specific, and that will help your diet develop. In people who get serious problems with their gut, let's talk about Clostridium difficile, C. diff. This is a diarrhea that usually is caused by antibiotics, but it can be contagious in hospitals. People get C. diff diarrhea. A bacteria called Clostridium tends to take over your gut and cause horrendous immune-induced diarrhea. And it can kill you. It can be a fatal disease. Bad C. diff is fatal in lots of people. One of the things we do is give you antibiotics to kill the C. diff, but antibiotics that hopefully will stay just in your gut, like vancomycin, to try to sterilize the C. diff. But one of the things we've learned in the last few years is you can also take healthy microbiomes in the form of poop, isolate the bacteria from the poop, and inject it into people's guts, both from above and below, and restore their microbiome and get rid of the C. diff. So one of the treatments for refractory C. diff in a lot of places now is what's called a microbiome transplant or a bacterial transplant, where we take healthy microbiomes from people and transplant them into people's guts who are extremely sick. That can make a huge difference.
There's some emerging literature that suggests that FMT, which is a fecal microbiome transplant, can also be beneficial for patients with irritable bowel syndrome.
Right.
So this is where we're going, but this is really a shotgun therapy. What we want to do is isolate what is it about those bacteria, which of those bacteria are really important, and then we can come up with a more tailored.
Yes, we want to know which bacteria kill the C. diff, so that instead of giving you a bunch of bacteria that could cause other problems, we can give you specific bacteria that help your gut function better. And the other thing is different people with different genetics like different bacteria. and their food that they grow up with determines it. So you can't digest seaweed, but certain kids in Japan who grew up with a high seaweed diet can digest seaweed. And you can't digest sorghum, but kids raised on sorghum can digest some certain amount of sorghum. So your microbiome is partly determined by what you eat, and what you eat partly determines your microbiome.
So it goes back to what Dr. Treisman said earlier in this talk. We think of ourselves as the uber organism and the microbiota are serving our needs. The microbiota are using humans for energy. What's better than sitting in the bowel of a human being and being fed every 6 to 8 hours? So they'll adapt. They'll adapt to our genetics. They'll adapt to our immune system. And because our immune system and genetics are different from individuals to individuals, you may have differences in the microbiota. But the purpose of the microbiota is exactly the same. I want to make this vehicle, which we call human, work so that I can get fed. It's in the bacteria's interest to maintain a healthy human being, because that's the human being dies, there's no more source of food. So this is what we call a symbiotic relationship. We just need to understand this better, because it's only in the last decade or so that we recognized that this other superorganism is actually so critical to our well-being.
And getting back to what you mentioned very early in the conversation, Dr. Pasricha, there's a question from Max Cohen. He says, regarding Dr. Pasricha's interest in vagus cutting to help with anxiety and depression in rats, many patients, parentheses, in older days especially, close parentheses, had vagus cutting and opening of the pylorus to treat ulcer disease. Were they so benefited psychiatrically?
Very good question. We're trying to answer this question.
Great question.
We're trying to answer this question. It's very difficult to do this, right? Because nobody does vagotomy anymore. But we need to get access to databases, and we're actually in the process of doing that, where we want to see what are the long-term consequences of vagotomy. Now, clearly, our experiments have shown that cutting the vagus helps rats with depression and anxiety. We also know that cutting the vagus, as Dr. Treisman mentioned, cutting the vagus prevents Parkinson's from developing in certain models in mice. We also know in humans that those who had a vagotomy because of ulcer many years ago, overall, they have a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease. We don't know the same about anxiety and depression, but we will hopefully find out, because now we have access to large databases where we can actually ask those questions. But the truth is, nobody wants to do a vagotomy because, yes, it may prevent one particular disease or disorder, but the vagus is so important for so many other things that it creates its own set of problems. So that's an experimental proof of concept, but our job is to understand what is it that the vagus is actually signaling? What is it that's causing the vagus to signal it? So we can then manipulate that in a much more safe and effective way than doing something drastic like cutting a vital nerve such as the vagus.
Very interesting. I have some more questions available, and this goes back to the dopamine conversation. Are some people super producers of dopamine, and do the levels of dopamine change over the life course?
Great question. So there's two elements to dopamine. There's how many cells are releasing the dopamine and how much they release. And then there's how many cells are receiving the dopamine, because dopamine comes out of one cell and is squirted onto another cell and transmits that way. So changes in dopamine receptors will change how much dopamine transmission there is, even in the same amount of dopamine. And the system is so complicated that we haven't been able to show whether or not people who have lots of energy, lots of drive, and are sort of hyperthymic super people, who can do all kinds of different things. Whether that's, how much of that's dopamine and how much of it is other things, we don't know the answer yet. We do know that if we change dopamine receptors, we can profoundly change drive. And if we kill dopamine neurons, we can profoundly change drive as well. So Parkinson's disease is a disease of dopamine neurons, and they die out in part of your brain, but they also decrease in other parts of your brain. And one of the things that happens to people with Parkinson's is they get very apathetic. They lose any interest in doing things, and they're disinterested in the world. They get disconnected. The more the dopamine is decreased in the part where you get your the more of that apathy there is. So dopamine, diminished dopamine produces apathy. Does too much dopamine or excessive dopamine produce more drive and more reward? Probably, but we don't have good data on it. We don't have good experimental evidence. We don't have foods where we can say, eat this food and have more dopamine, because we don't know how much of the dopamine in your gut. Remember, Dr. Pasricha at the beginning pointed out that 50% of the dopamine in your body is in your gut. We don't know what that dopamine is doing in your gut, but we do know that that dopamine is very important in your brain for drive. We suspect that dopamine is very important in your gut for something, because otherwise there wouldn't be so much of it there.
And we have another question. This is a men's health forum. So are there any differences between men and women as it relates to their gut and the microbiome?
That is a very complicated question, because your hormones play a big role in your gut microbiome composition, and your gut microbiome composition probably plays a role in your hormones. So a simple answer is, yes, there's a big difference between men and women. And there's a difference in some of the disorders we see in men and women. For instance, women are 4 times more likely to have depression, maybe even higher, than men do. And we don't know why that is. Men are more likely to have other kinds of, like for alcoholism, men are more likely to have troubles with alcoholism. And in a weird thing, your genetics of your gut microbiome, your gut nervous system, tend to determine your alcohol preference. People with certain kinds of guts are more likely to are more vulnerable to alcoholism. So we don't know the details of the different.
So just to add to that, most disorders of gut motility, those disorders that affect the brain of the gut, are also 4 to 5 times more common in women than in men. So we also know that the menstrual period affects gut motility clearly in lots of women. And they're, it's not just the cramps that they experience, but they also experience changes in bowel habits, nausea. And that's because they're differently wired with respect to their gut nerves than men are. So I guess if you think about this from a men's perspective, it's kind of good news, but it's not really, because men are also susceptible to these disorders. And when they get these disorders, they are much less able to cope with them than most women can. And the ability to cope in any disease is truly important with respect to how the disease affects your life and your quality of life.
Very good. We're going to take one more question, and this is a little bit of a curveball to the doctors, but you mentioned that there is a two-way pathway between the brain and the gut and the brain. This is a question from Mr. Lawrence Bricker, and he says, are there any other two-way highways, like brain to specific organs? Can they be used to, let's say, suppress cancers by changes in thoughts, wishes, hopes, or intentions?
So let me quickly answer that, because I've done some research in this. There is now a significant amount of evidence that the microenvironment of a tumor, of a cancer, is critical in determining its behavior, whether it grows, whether it spreads, whether it goes to other places, metastases. And the microenvironment has traditionally been thought of only in terms of the immune cells. That's why we have this explosion of immune therapy for cancer. But increasingly, we are recognizing, in particularly in some kinds of cancer, pancreatic cancer, prostatic cancer, for example, that the nerves are also critical in determining the growth of or the behavior of that cancer. And so when nerves are involved, any nerve is always in communication with the central nervous system, your brain here. Now, having said that, cancer is a very far advanced stage of a disorder, right? When you get clinically obvious cancer, it's difficult to say that positive thoughts or whatever you want to do, meditation, yoga, is going to really impact cancer at that stage. However, it is not that illogical to think that you may be able to prevent those kinds of growths by modulating your nerves through those activities. But that's speculation on my part. But I just want to make sure that people understand that as far as Dr. Treisman and I know, once you get that stage of cancer, you've got to hit it with everything and as hard as you can, because only resorting to these other treatments is not going to be beneficial.
Very
Glenn,
good.
you want to add to
Thank you.
something?
No, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that people coming in with the right attitude seem to do better with cancer. And I think that what that reflects is that people with depression caused by their cancer do more poorly. They do more poorly with diabetes, with heart attacks, with strokes, and people with depression do more poorly with cancer. And that's partly because the cancers make chemicals that make you depressed. So I think that going after the depression with either mindfulness and exercise and a positive attitude, which can help, but also medications if needed, will really help people survive their cancer treatment.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, doctors, thank you. Thank you so much for educating us tonight. This is a very, very intriguing subject and really learned a lot. And I'm sure there are a lot more questions and thoughts that people would have. And we'll have to have them address it at some other time.
Yep.
I'd like to remind the audience that after you sign off tonight from tonight's webinar, you will receive and see a link for our survey. We really appreciate it if you could fill out the survey, because it's very important for Suburban Hospital so that we can design programs that fit your needs and give you what you want to have a healthy lifestyle. So please fill out the survey that you receive when you sign off. Again, we really appreciate your attendance tonight. Thank you, Dr. Pasricha. Thank you, Dr. Treisman. It was wonderful. I learned a lot. And now I have to go back and do a lot more reading on my own.
Well, thank you again. And have a good night, everybody.
Thank you all for inviting us. We appreciate it very much. Good
It was
night.
wonderful.